Unsolved mysteries are by no means a modern thing, since some of the most baffling events that have ever happened date back centuries. This means that we'll likely never be able to solve them, as no new witnesses can be interviewed, no additional evidence can be found, and in the end, all we can do is speculate about what really occurred all those years ago. The case of the disappearance of Patricia Otto, which occurred on the 31st of August, 1976, is one that's full of twists, turns, and sometimes unbelievable events that seem to suggest her life was ended by her husband. But since vital pieces of evidence have been destroyed, we may never know what happened to her. Patricia and her husband Ralph were living in Lewiston, Idaho at the time, but their marriage was far from ideal. Ralph, who was 18 years older than Patricia, was known to have a violent temper, leading to her filing for divorce. But with Mother's Day just around the corner, the couple decided to try and remedy the relationship, since they had 2 children aged 3 and 5. 3 months later, on the 31st of August, the couple's 2 daughters had been visiting with their grandmother, and Patricia traveled to her house to get them. According to Ralph, he and Patricia got into a heated argument shortly after she got home, and she stormed out, never to be seen again. One of their daughters would later tell investigators that she saw her father striking her mother, and that he'd picked her up with his hands wrapped around her throat. She added that he then carried her away, but she couldn't say where to. When Patricia was still nowhere to be found the next day, her sister filed a missing person report. Ralph drove to the sister's house, where he dropped his 2 children off, saying that he was going to look for his wife. It soon came to investigators' attention that Ralph was a jealous man who had accused Patricia of cheating on him with someone else. This only further heightened their suspicions, along with the fact that Ralph told his daughters that their mother had willingly chosen to leave without them. Ralph was repeatedly questioned, which he saw as harassment, and he hatched a plan to put it to a stop. He met with a hitman and asked him to end the life of the Lewiston police captain who was leading the investigation into Patricia's disappearance. Unbeknownst to him, though, the man he'd spoken to was an undercover police officer. Following the conversation between them, Ralph was arrested and sent to prison for 10 years. He would only spend half that time in jail, though, as it was found that Idaho didn't consider the hiring of a hitman to be synonymous with attempted murder, so he was set free. It seemed as though Patricia's case would never be solved, but in August of 1978, a set of female remains, later named the Finley Creek Jane Doe, was found at Finley Creek, Oregon, 3 hours' drive from the family's house where Patricia was last seen. The woman who was found was dressed in similar clothing to Patricia's when she was last seen, but the connection between the 2 cases wasn't made, and the remains were cremated when she couldn't be identified. The clothes that the deceased woman was wearing were also destroyed, along with any evidence that may have been present. One of the couple's daughters saw a sketch of the woman, and she's convinced that it was indeed her mother who was found, but has been unable to prove it as of yet. Anyone who has any information on this case is asked to contact the Lewiston Police Department at 208-746-0171. Thanks to advances in technology, scientists are able, with relative accuracy, to predict when an earthquake is likely to occur, though it's still by no means an exact science. Nevertheless, the technology that we use to predict these tremors, such as seismometers, have saved countless lives over the years. Since this technology wasn't available in ancient times, earthquakes were far more unpredictable, and hence claimed many more lives when they struck unexpectedly. In some cultures, the tremors were seen as messages from the gods, usually a warning of bad times to come. But one Chinese inventor who lived 2,000 years ago seemingly invented a device that could warn him and his people of an incoming earthquake. And today, we have no idea how he could have devised such a system with limited knowledge. The man in question was Zang Hang, who was not only an inventor but also a mathematician, engineer, geographer, and astronomer, who lived sometime around 132 AD. He was clearly ahead of his time as far as technology was concerned. The device that he invented was fashioned using what looks like an ancient wine jar or a metal container that was used to heat water over a fire. It measured about 6.5 feet in diameter, and around the outside it was decorated with 8 dragon's heads, each representing a different compass point. But these dragons weren't just added for decoration. They each had a small bronze ball in their mouths, beneath which was a toad with its mouth wide open. In the event of a tremor, the ball would drop into the toad's mouth, showing not only that an earthquake was about to hit, but what direction it was traveling from. But we have no idea how these balls were kept in place or why the balls would suddenly drop upon detecting a tremor. It's been suggested that a stick was placed in the middle of the device, and when a vibration was felt, it would fall over, causing the ball to roll into the toad's mouth. When the ball hit the toad's mouth, a sound could be heard, and whoever was watching over the device would immediately warn everyone to get ready for an earthquake. While many people were skeptical about the device's efficacy, it was proven to work on one occasion in 138 AD. In that instance, a ball fell into a toad's mouth, indicating that an earthquake had hit to the west of the capital city. It caused quite a stir, but many people doubted whether the earthquake had actually occurred. That is, until a few days had passed and a messenger arrived to report that a tremor had indeed hit the region, which lay to the west of the city. Furthermore, he stated that the quake happened at the same time that the ball fell, confirming that Zang Hang was not only correct, but that he was one of the brightest minds alive at the time. A reward of up to $50,000 is being offered to anyone who comes forward with information leading to the whereabouts of 27-year-old Julianne Miller, who disappeared on the 22nd of September 1982. To date, there's only been one suspect in this case, but investigators have been unable to prove his guilt despite a lot of evidence suggesting that James Clayton, Julianne's boyfriend, is responsible for ending her life. Julianne had been married once in the past, but that relationship didn't last long. After her marriage ended, her father gifted her with a cottage, which was situated in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, and she immediately moved in. She lived in the cottage while studying at the University of Hartford, and before long, she and James met. She invited him to move in with her, and he readily agreed. To make extra money while studying, Julianne worked at a daycare center, and for reasons unknown, she decided to transfer half of the cottage to James. But she would soon discover that this was a mistake when their relationship started to fall apart about a year after they met, and she started making arrangements to have James removed from the deed. In September of 1982, she acquired a quitclaim deed, and it was now certain that she'd be following through with her plans. This likely also meant that the couple wouldn't be together for much longer, but they continued living together for the time being. The very next day, Julianne went missing. A neighbor would report seeing her sitting on the couch in the cottage with James. The couple was watching TV together, but before long they started discussing the deed, resulting in an argument. This was the last time that Julianne was seen. But strangely, James never filed a missing person report. He would later claim that he didn't do so, since he applied for a job with the state police, and in his opinion, such a report would hamper his chances of being hired. Instead, Julianne's parents reported her as missing 8 days later when they couldn't contact her. When the cottage was searched, Julianne's purse, glasses, and her vehicle were found to still be there, as was her dog, Bojo. Inside her purse, investigators found the quick deed document that she had acquired, and they noted that James had signed it. James became a suspect early on, thanks to his inaction following Julianne's disappearance, but he maintained his innocence. He stated that she left the house that day and got into a brown pickup truck with an unknown man, but then things started to get strange. Some of the furniture in the cottage had been moved, and cushions on the couch had suddenly gone missing. White spots were found on the carpet in the living room, suggesting that someone had used bleach to clean areas on it. James claimed that the cushions were at the dry cleaners, but when the carpet and couch were tested, they were found to contain biological material, which James claimed belonged to Bojo. James forced 2 tenants who lived in the cottage to move out, though they were asked to take polygraph tests, which they both passed. James was also asked to take the same test, but he refused. Some of Julianne's grandmother's jewelry had gone missing, and it was later discovered that the pieces had been pawned by James's brother. The case has since gone cold, with James still being the only suspect, but he cannot be arrested due to a lack of evidence. If you know where Julianne is or what happened to her, you're asked to contact the Old Saybrook Police Department at 860-395-3140. Ramsu, also known as Adam's Bridge, is an ancient bridge that connects India to Sri Lanka. but its origins are a mystery that has left scholars scratching their heads for centuries, since many people believe that it wasn't actually constructed, but formed by nature instead. The bridge begins on Tibberon Island in India and ends on Mannar Island in Sri Lanka. While most scientific studies have determined that it was formed naturally, some religious theories have been put forward in an effort to explain its existence. In the Hindu faith, it's said that the bridge was created by Lord Rama, who was aided by an army of monkeys that did his bidding. He needed to get to Sri Lanka since his wife Sita had been taken captive and was being held there against her will. According to this theory, the bridge was constructed in 5000 BC, and quite surprisingly, carbon dating that was performed on the bridge seems to indicate that this time frame is correct, further deepening the mystery. Some archaeologists and geologists have stated that some of the stones used in the bridge's construction are up to 7,000 years old, while the sandbar beneath it is said to be much younger, about 4,000 years old. According to legend, it was possible to use the bridge to walk from one side to the other, a distance of about 30 miles, until sometime in the 15th century, possibly 1480, when a series of storms hit the area, causing the channel beneath it to become much deeper and rendering the bridge inaccessible. As for the scientists who maintain that it is a natural formation, they've found the bridge to be made up of a series of linear coral reefs or limestone reefs. These reefs sit between 3 and 32 feet beneath the water, which means that any ships in the area have to sail around it or risk running aground. It's also been suggested that Sri Lanka and India were once part of the same landmass, and that when they drifted apart, a small section of land trailed behind, forming the bridge that we know today, though this theory has never been proven. While the structure is known as Ram Setu, Nala Setu, and Setu Banda, it's also called Adam's Bridge in honor of Adam's Peak, which is located in Sri Lanka and said to be in the exact spot where Adam, the first man created in the Bible, fell when he was expelled from the Garden of Eden. Today, talks are being held to decide whether a second, usable bridge should be constructed over Adam's Bridge, since it would connect India to Sri Lanka, making it easy to travel between the two countries. But this has caused some uproar in both of these countries. 25-year-old Nancy Deborah Willis, known to her friends as Debbie, has been missing for a very long time, and hopes of finding out what happened to her are quickly dwindling. But her case remains open, and investigators are still encouraging anyone with information on the case to come forward. Nancy spent her childhood growing up in Yuma, Virginia, during the 1960s. Her family eventually relocated to Johnson City, Tennessee, Myrtle Beach in South Carolina, and Denver, Colorado, before eventually settling in Ringgold, Georgia. As an adult, she married a man named Howard Hawk Willis, and the couple had 2 children. They moved to Bradley County, Tennessee, and were in the process of building a house of their own when Nancy suddenly went missing. It's known that Nancy spent time in Gate City, Virginia, with her family on the 23rd of December, 1986. They celebrated Christmas early, since Nancy was meant to be back home for Christmas Day. But after leaving Gate City, she suddenly vanished, never to be seen or heard from again. When she failed to make contact with her family, they became concerned that something had happened to her, and she was reported as missing. Investigators immediately spoke to Howard, but he stated that Nancy had left him in March of that year and that he hadn't seen her since. He added that as far as he knew, she took a bus to Chattanooga in Tennessee, since he'd dropped her off at the bus stop, but he had no idea where she went from there. He would, however, end up in a lot of trouble with the law in the years to come. In 2002, Howard was charged with ending the lives of 2 people, Adam and Samantha Chrismer, a couple who had just gotten married and were living with Howard's mother in Johnson City. His guilt in this case became apparent when he was caught on a recording made by his ex-wife, Wilda Gadd, admitting that he'd ended the couple's lives with a firearm. The recording was made with the aid of Bradley County Sheriff's Office, and with this evidence in hand, Howard's fate was sealed. Howard was eventually found guilty in the charges against him in 2010, and he received the death penalty. But he was also implicated in another equally heinous crime. He was suspected of having been responsible for the disappearance of his stepfather, Sam Thomas, who was later also found deceased. Howard wasn't charged with this crime due to a lack of evidence, but investigators are certain that he's the culprit and that he may be linked to the Chrismers. He's the only suspect in Nancy's disappearance, but has also not been charged with this crime, since she's never been found and her fate remains unknown. If you know what happened to Nancy, or have any contributions to this case, you're asked to contact the Bradley County Sheriff's Department at 615-476-0572. In February of 1567, Lord Darnley, also known as Henry, was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, and at first they were head over heels in love. But Darnley soon started to resent his wife's power, leading to an event that destroyed their relationship. As time passed, he grew weary of not always being the focus of Mary's attention, since she was often otherwise engaged, thanks to her duties as queen. Having had enough, he attempted to assert control over her by having her secretary's life ended in front of her. But this was a bad idea, as the event only deepened Mary's resentment towards him, and their relationship only deteriorated further. At the same time, the Scottish lords of the time started to worry that Darnley held too much power, and that he needed to be taught a lesson. He was also the subject of rumors that he was having affairs with several men, and it was proven that he'd been unfaithful to Mary, having been involved with a number of women over the years as well. He had a child out of wedlock and was in the habit of visiting brothels on occasion. Hence, Mary denied him the matrimonial crown, leading to the rift in their marriage and his ultimate demise, according to some historians. In February of 1567, Darnley had fallen ill. It's believed that he was either suffering from smallpox or syphilis, and he was taken to Kirko Field in Edinburgh, where he stayed at the Provost's Lodge while he attempted to recover. On the 10th of February, Mary visited him there, after which she traveled to Holyrood, where one of her ladies-in-waiting was getting married. Then, at around 2 a.m. that morning, the city was rocked by a massive explosion that occurred at Kirko Field. Darnley and his servant were both found deceased in a neighbor's orchard. Since they were dressed in their night clothes, it's assumed that they ran from the building but were unable to escape before the blast. But upon further investigation, it was found that their lives had not been ended by explosion, but that they'd been strangled by an unknown person. The mystery only deepened when it was revealed that strange items were strewn around their bodies, including a sharpened blade, a length of rope, and a chair. At the top of the suspect list were Mary and her counselor, Bothwell. Rumors that they were responsible only became more rampant when the pair got married a few months later, but no evidence was ever found to implicate either of them. This marriage also wouldn't last, and it would ultimately spell the end for Mary. After she and Bothwell separated, Mary fled to England, and there she was arrested by the orders of Queen Elizabeth II, who maintained that she was responsible for Darnley's demise. She was imprisoned for the next 19 years until she was eventually executed, and according to many scholars, took the secret of what happened to Darnley to the grave with her. It's been suggested that she knew about the murderous plot, since she was supposed to be staying with him at Kirko Field on the night of the explosion, but remembered at the last moment that she needed to travel to Holyrood for the wedding. To this day, Darnley's case remains unsolved, and it's likely to remain that way forever. 22-year-old Stephen Hendricks' disappearance, which took place on the 5th of September, 1988, is a strange one indeed. It involves a fire that was set at his house in Washington, Indiana on the day of his disappearance, and his case has never been solved. At the time, Stephen worked at Craney's Body Shop, and he was engaged to an 18-year-old woman named Rebecca Harvey. By all accounts, their relationship was doing well, as the couple had decided to move in together, and Rebecca moved her belongings into Stephen's house on Oak Grove Road. She worked at a pizza restaurant to make extra money. But on the 5th of September of that year, something sinister happened that investigators are still unable to explain. At around 3:30 a.m. that morning, a neighbor contacted the police and frantically reported that Stephen's house was engulfed in flames. Firefighters were deployed to the scene, but by the time they arrived, the house was already beyond saving, and the fire was burning so intensely that it had caused paint to start bubbling and peeling off the cars that were parked in the house's driveway. Fearing that someone may be trapped inside, firefighters entered the house and unfortunately found Rebecca inside. It was quickly determined that the fire had been set intentionally, since gasoline was used as an accelerant, but the motive was unknown. No sign of Stephen was found inside the house, and it's believed that he may have been forcibly removed from the building, and that he then became a victim of foul play. In the weeks that followed, no sign of him was found. He never picked up his $2,000 worth of tools from Craney's body shop and never collected his last paycheck, which of course was very out of the ordinary. Inside the house, investigators found his keys, wallet, all of his clothes, and his car still parked in the driveway. This suggested that this was no mere robbery gone wrong, and that Stephen hadn't simply decided to leave of his own accord, since he would have taken his wallet and likely would have left his car. It isn't known whether any suspects were formally identified, but one man, a former boyfriend of Rebecca's, was questioned and asked to provide an alibi for the time when the fire was started. He was unable to do so, but he was also never arrested or charged. It isn't known why, but in 2019, investigators searched Oak Grove Cemetery in connection with Stephen's case, but they've declined to say whether they found any clues. It later came to light that a rumor had been spread about a fresh grave being dug at the cemetery. This case remains open, and anyone with useful information is urged to contact either the Indiana State Police at 812-482-1441 or the Davies County Sheriff's Office at 812-254-1060. In 1977, South Africa was a very different country from the one we know today. It was a thriving and quickly developing country with a massive amount of resources that were being used to develop it even further. And compared to today, crime statistics were very low. That doesn't mean that crimes weren't being committed, though. One of the most memorable bank heists in South Africa's history took place on Easter weekend of that year, and to this day the culprits have never been identified. The robbery took a lot of planning, as was discovered after the fact. Someone who was operating under the alias Mr. Nightingale had entered an empty store in the town's central business district and started digging a tunnel. The tunnel would eventually reach all the way to the vault of a Standard Bank branch, where he then proceeded to remove the equivalent of $1.1 million in today's money, before making his getaway without ever being noticed. The robber was given the moniker Mr. Nightingale, since this was the name used to rent the vacant shop where the tunnel was dug. Many people believe that it wasn't just the work of one man, but that a group of robbers worked throughout the weekend after months of planning. Since no suspects were ever identified, many theories have been put forward over the years, one of which suggests that one of the culprits was a man who worked as a miner at the time, and the evidence is rather compelling. A few witnesses came forward to report that they'd seen several men wearing blue coveralls in the area at the time of the robbery, but since the store was being renovated, this wasn't anything strange. One woman, the owner of a hair salon next to the vacant store, told investigators that she entered the shop at around 11:30 p.m. one night during the weekend, since she'd forgotten her book inside. She heard some activity happening in the store next door, but didn't think much of it at the time, and only after hearing about the robbery did she realize that she must have heard the robbers digging their tunnel. Investigators at the time stated that whoever was responsible for digging the tunnel must have had experience as a miner, since they clearly knew what they were doing. Timber was used to keep the tunnel from collapsing, and despite the store where it was bought being identified, the person who bought it never was. In the months that followed, a composite sketch of one of the robbers was created, since he was seen while renting the store. Several miners who worked with a man named John believed that the sketch looked uncannily like him, and furthermore, he lived on Nightingale Street. The men never reported this to the authorities, since John was working at the time of the robbery and was seen by several people at the mine. They've also maintained that he was too civilized of a person to have committed a robbery. Another man, known only as A. Vandermerve, also has a theory of his own. At the time, he was working for a repo company, and he was asked to get a vehicle from a nearby town. When he arrived, no one was at the address, and he was told by neighbors that the owner hadn't been around for a few days. He was left with no other option than to enter the property unassisted. Upon entering the house, he was surprised to find several expensive watches inside, along with mining struts, pickaxes, and lights that were found in the house's garage. Most incriminating, though, was a blueprint of the Standard Bank branch that was also found in the garage. The missing vehicle was eventually found in Johannesburg, loaded with a mound of soil. The prevailing theory is that the robbers fled the country shortly after committing the heist, and it remains one of South Africa's most compelling mysteries that will likely never be solved. The murder of Zenanza, the son of a Hittite king, is a mystery that has plagued Egyptologists for a very long time. And today we're no closer to learning what happened to him after he lost his life while traveling to Egypt to marry a queen. Another mystery from the same time concerns a woman named Dakamunzu. What we do know is that she's mentioned on several occasions in a series of letters, known as the Amarna letters, that tell of Egypt's relations with Babylonia, Palestine, Cyprus, Syria, and other countries during the late 18th dynasty. Her name is mostly mentioned regarding an event that came to be known as the Zenanza affair, which involves a young girl named Ankhesenamun. She was the daughter of Nefertiti, who was queen at the time, and the pharaoh Akhenaten. Shortly after celebrating her 13th birthday, Ankhesenamun married King Tut, who also served as pharaoh until he passed away at the age of 18. This meant that Ankhesenamun had to look for a new husband, and of course many older men showed interest, since they stood to gain not only a lot of wealth but also power. But Ankhesenamun wanted her bloodline to remain loyal, and in a desperate attempt she wrote to the king of the Hittites, who was seen as one of her most feared enemies. The letter reads, quote, "My husband has died and I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. I would not wish to take one of my subjects as a husband. I am afraid." It's been suggested that Ankhesenamun wrote this letter under a pseudonym that meant the great king's wife, rather than her actual name, but this has never been proven. The king understandably found the letter suspicious, so he sent an envoy to confirm the author's claims, and when he realized the letter had been sent by Ankhesenamun, he agreed to send his son, Zenanza, to Egypt to marry her. This meant that he would be crowned a pharaoh, and that Egypt and the Hittite Empire would become one. It was a win-win situation, but the marriage would never happen, as Zenanza was ambushed while on his way to Egypt, and his life was ended. The first suspect was a man named A, who was crowned as a new pharaoh. Abe denied any involvement, but the king could not be convinced, and he ordered an attack on Egyptian settlements in Syria. Some of the people who were taken as prisoners were, unbeknownst to the king, very ill, and upon being brought back to his native Hattusa, started spreading whatever disease they were suffering from. This led to an epidemic breaking out, and many people, including the king, lost their lives. Ankhesenamun was now forced to marry A against her will, but shortly after doing so, she suddenly disappeared. Historians state that she passed away under suspicious circumstances between 1325 and 1321 BC, and it's been suggested that her life was ended by the order of the pharaoh A. It's also speculated that Ankhesenamun was responsible for ending Zenanza's life, but this has also never been confirmed. We have no idea how Zenanza perished or who the culprit was in his demise. Likewise, we can only speculate as to what happened to Ankhesenamun after she disappeared, and she's now referred to as Egypt's lost princess, and a mystery that will likely endure for centuries to come. Joseph Headley, also known as Joe the Quilter, lost his life to murder on the 3rd of January 1826, and the crime remains an unsolved mystery almost 2 centuries later, as no one was ever charged with the crime. At the time, Joe was living in Warden, a parish in Northumberland, England, though he often traveled around the country looking for quilting work whenever he could find it. His work had become known in several parts of England, since he was said to be a remarkable quilter, but that night he met a grisly end. According to witnesses, Joe had visited Warwick Grange, where he bought a pitcher of milk, a pound of sugar, and some meat from a woman named Mrs. Colbeck, who was the wife of a farmer. A man named William Herdman would later tell the police that he stopped in at Joe's place on his way home from work at a paper mill at around 6 p.m., and that Joe was in the middle of cooking a dinner consisting of a few potatoes. He spoke to a woman named Mrs. Biggs at 7 p.m. after she knocked on his door to ask for directions to Four Stones. She'd gotten lost in the pitch darkness while traveling from Stamfordham, but Joe was more than willing to send her in the right direction. By all accounts, this was the last time that Joe was seen alive. A man named Mr. Smith recalled riding past Joe's cottage at about 8 p.m., and that the place was completely dark and silent. When Joe didn't emerge from his cottage for a few days, his neighbors grew concerned, and when they investigated, they found what looked like biological material in the snow outside his door. When he didn't answer their knocks, they broke into the college and were shocked to find the walls covered in biological material, and that a quilt in the building had a handprint on it that also contained some material. The items that he bought earlier that day were still on his kitchen table, but it was a storage building that a horrific discovery was made in. Here, they found Joe deceased, and it was immediately obvious that he'd been brutally attacked by at least 2 people. When the cottage was searched, it was discovered that 2 silver tablespoons, 4 teaspoons, and 2 salt cellars were missing. Biological material was found throughout the cottage, and several pieces of furniture were strewn about, suggesting that a lengthy struggle had taken place. Defensive marks on Joe's hand suggested that he fought back valiantly, but ultimately came off the worse. It was ultimately suggested that he managed to flee the cottage, but that his attackers caught up with him at the storage shed. No suspects were ever identified, despite a small piece of a coat being found in a nearby hedge, along with a pair of clogs, and eventually the cottage and the remaining furniture were sold, leaving Joe the Quilter's case an unsolved historical mystery that contains far more questions than answers. In the summer of 1693, yellow fever was an issue all across Eastern American cities. The disease ran rampant through Boston, and theories as to where it came from began to arise. Some physicians began to theorize that mosquitoes were responsible for transmitting the disease. The yellow fever mosquito theory was only put to the test once a large outbreak occurred in New Orleans. But instead of just gaining some confirmation as to where the disease was coming from, history got a lot more than it bargained for. The outbreak in New Orleans revealed just how terrible the disease could get. Victims suffered from high fevers, jaundice, and violent spew-ups. The disease would ultimately become responsible for many social structures, but it was also found to contribute to famous legends, including that of the vampire. As the disease gripped its victims, they suffered from jaundicing, which led to the sensitivity to daylight. As the body shriveled and weakened, patients began to look gaunt. Their gum lines receded, making it appear as though they had unusually long teeth. The takeover of the epidemic led to large percentages of the New Orleans population being wiped out, eventually earning it the name Necropolis City. As the disease progressed, the internal makeup of patients was placed under attack. Vital fluid was mixed in the spew. It also ran from their eyes, nose, and ears, sometimes even their toes. The once healthy patients now looked vastly different, like living corpses. This also led to some outlandish conclusions, paired with a poor understanding of viruses and diseases. While the mosquito transmission theory was the most plausible, many sought a more supernatural explanation. This prompted the creation of vampire legends that have been carried through the times. The hemorrhaging that patients experienced led to the idea that vampires were responsible for the disease. The end stages of yellow fever contributed to and supported the vampire hysteria of the 1800s. As news traveled to other areas, legends of vampirism sparked along the Mississippi too. But it wasn't just the living effects of the disease that led to such conclusions. During this time, residents began to report strange noises that were emitting from the graves of the deceased. Some even claimed that the soil appeared to be disturbed. The claims prompted the reopening of burial grounds. According to historical sources, when coffins were opened, the corpses looked warm, blushed, and swollen. Today, we know that this is part of the regular decomposition process, but this wasn't so widely understood in the 1800s. For this reason, the natural process was rather viewed as something supernatural and vampiristic in nature. It was also thought that not all vampires left their graves, but their foul vapor did. Many thought that the miasma could also carry the disease, again affecting the public. To protect themselves from the miasma, residents would use garlic or something similar to ward off dangerous vapors. The decision would also lend itself to vampire mythology and the use of garlic to deter them. It was 1807, a time during which Napoleon Bonaparte was at the peak of his power. The French Empire and Imperial Russia were engaged in quite a war, which he sought to put a stop to. That year, the treaties of Tilsit came into existence, and without hesitation, the successful general signed it, ending the disruptive war. He was revered as one of the greatest military commanders, with battles and ambitions that shaped Western Europe. Napoleon was undefeated until it came to that fateful day of signing the treaty. It was a joyous day for Russia and the French, and it couldn't go without celebration. Napoleon decided that a day of rabbit hunting would be festive enough and sent his chief of staff, Alexander Berthier, to oversee its planning. Instead of collecting wild rabbits, which would have taken too long to sort out on such short notice, Alexander headed to the local farm and acquired well over 3,000 rabbits, all of whom were tame. The docile nature would allow the commander and others invited to the party to have plenty of bunnies at their disposal without them escaping into the nearby shrubbery. The planning was quick, and things began taking shape on a large open field. Guests were arriving, and the rabbits were placed in cages at the edges of the patch, waiting for the man of the hour. Napoleon arrived at the event in his carriage, expecting a day filled with fun. Little did anyone know that the hunter was about to become the hunted. The moment he stepped from his carriage, the thousands of rabbits were released. The small creatures immediately rampaged toward Napoleon and onlookers who stood nearby. These domestic animals were not scared of humans at all. In fact, they believed it was feeding time. Hundreds of rabbits latched onto the unsuspecting commander, who desperately tried to fling them off. In search of their food, they nipped at his legs, and according to a historian, David Chandler, it appeared as though the bunnies had taken a sort of strategy to successfully overthrow the party. They had divided into two equal parts, half of whom flanked the French leader, and the other half tormented the guests. Initially, the onslaught appeared comical and many laughed at their behavior, but the rabbits were out for revenge. Expressions of fear soon replaced the smiles, and giggles waned into screams of terror as the swarm of bunnies brought the men to their knees. In desperation, the terrorized onlookers and guards attempted to repel them with riding crops, sticks, and whips, but nothing seemed to deter them. Napoleon was unable to accurately position his firearm to end the uprising and was short just a couple thousand slugs. The only other option was to retreat, and the commander did just that. He ran past crying guests and screaming men as he sought the solace of his imperial coach. But even as Napoleon clambered into his seat, the rabbits still did not relent, and some even managed to make their way inside. Napoleon was humiliated by the events that had just taken place, only regaining composure once he was far away from the chaos, and after having to toss some of the hungry beasts out the window. Eventually, the thousands of rabbits began to scatter. It turned out that they hadn't been fed that day and just wanted their next meal. It was the 26th of September, 1983, a day that could have meant the end of the world. In the early morning hours amid the Cold War, when relations between the US and Soviet Union were severely strained, an engineer and lieutenant colonel of the Soviet Air Defense Force, Stanislav Petrov, was on duty at the command center. Petrov sat at the Serpukhov 15 bunker near Moscow, watching for signs of impending nuclear missile attacks. A satellite was equipped with an early warning network that would notify the officer if a strike was incoming. Such a warning would be received. The officer on duty was expecting to send the information up the chain of command, informing superiors of the impending attack against the Soviets, in which a case of immediate counterattack, also of nuclear nature, would be launched back at the United States. So in the early hours of the morning, just after midnight, the bunker's computer whirred, and a siren howled the warning that a ballistic missile was heading straight for the Soviet Union. The system was incredibly reliable. There was no doubt that doom was on its way. But Petrov just sat there, staring blankly at the red backlit screen, with the word launch staring right back at him. A minute went by, and the siren sounded again. It warned of a second incoming missile. It was shortly followed by a third, then a fourth, and finally a fifth. The screens changed their alerts to missile strike, but still Petrov sat there. The phone he would use to reach his superiors was within reachable distance, but he didn't even look at it. The lieutenant believed that the 5 blaring signals were nothing but a false alarm, so he waited. There was no rule that stated how long the attending officer would have to wait before reporting an impending strike. Petrov, though, knew that every second that he said nothing took away valuable time. He just hoped that he was right about the false alarm. Alongside Petrov, there were other Soviet Union experts, including IT specialists, who'd also been watching America's nuclear forces. A group of satellite operators got a hold of the officer and reported that no missiles were registering on the radar. But they were only a support device, and protocol stipulated that decisions needed to be made based on computer readings. The ultimate decision of what to do next rested solely with Petrov, the on-duty officer. He'd grown suspicious of the incoming missiles since the alert was so clear and strong. There were 29 other security levels that the detection would have to pass through. It just seemed impossible under these circumstances that the alert was so incredibly clear. Petrov finally picked up the phone and called an officer at the Soviet Army headquarters. But instead of reporting an incoming attack, he stated there was a system malfunction. If he was wrong though, the first impact would happen minutes later. But 23 minutes passed and there was no earth-shattering collision, and the officer could breathe a sigh of relief. If Petrov had followed protocol and allowed for a counter-launch, the results would have been catastrophic. The 26th of September, 1983, is forever marked as the day that the world almost ended. The Middle Ages was a time characterized by turmoil, a period during which society was faced with many challenges. The challenges took on various forms, including that of prevalent disease. Among these were dysentery, malaria, smallpox, leprosy, typhoid, flu, and diphtheria. Each disease, of course, carried its burdens, but none were as terrifying as St. Anthony's, which was also named Holy Fire or Internal Fire. The disease was notorious not just for the gruesome, unending symptoms, but also for the fear that surrounded it. The illness, a result of ergot poisoning, was characterized by some truly alarming manifestations. Patients exhibited signs of madness, physical pain, and psychological distress. Since there weren't many advancements in medications at the time, St. Anthony's Fire went untreated throughout the ordeal. This would result in the restriction of vital fluid flow, which gave way to excruciating burning sensations as gangrene began to gnaw away at its victims' extremities, ultimately leading to the detachment of fingers and toes. Sufferers of St. Anthony's Fire found themselves grappling with strange hallucinations, agitation, and spasms. Other severe symptoms included muscle cramps, nausea, insomnia, and convulsions, all of which began to take a toll on the ailing patients. It's widely believed that the symptoms are what led to the phenomenon of dancing epidemics or dancing plagues of the 14th and 17th centuries. The rise in fatalities and victims of the disease related to St. Anthony's Fire made for a grim picture of medieval society that was forced to battle an invisible army. While they didn't know it at the time, the disease had some unexpected roots. It was the direct consequence of bread consumption, a staple resource and the cheapest source of sustenance at the time. As populations rose all over the world, rye grain became a crucial source of food. The grain was used to make flour for bread. Little did they know that the increase in grains led to the growth of toxic fungus known as ergot. Unsuspecting victims would consume their baked goods, only to become fatally ill. Still, no one knew that this is what was causing St. Anthony's Fire, even though ergot was known to many. The continuous consumption of contaminated rye led to several more outbreaks, and communities were left in despair. It wasn't until many years later, in 1596, that a German physician named Wendelin Thelius made a breakthrough. He linked ergot to rye and subsequently to the terrifying illness that had plagued the world for years. With the absence of an understanding of viruses and bacteria, many people attributed the symptoms to divine punishment. The church sought to provide a reason behind the suffering and arrived at the conclusion that it was the result of sin. The outbreaks of the disease continued over the years with the constant consumption of infected food. The cycle persisted, leading to alarming fatalities. The disease was named after St. Anthony, who gave away all of his possessions to the poor. He then retreated into the desert area in Egypt and lived in solitude from 286 to 304 CE. While there, he lived as a monk and battled a struggle against the devil. The disease was named after him when it was suggested that the terrible illness could only be cured if the sufferer prayed to St. Anthony. The fire part of the name comes from the intense burning sensations that the patients would suffer, making them feel as though they were engulfed in flames. The Sea of Cortez lies host to hundreds of islands. A small strip leading from mainland Mexico connects to a particular island said to be the most mysterious and most dangerous of them all. Tibberon Island is only accessible through that small strip during low tide. Surrounding it is a wild sea that led to the nickname Little Hell. Tibberon once found itself the home of the indigenous group called the Seri. They were first and resisted both the Spanish and Mexican takeovers, defending themselves and their land with violence. But as more ranchers relocated to the area, the population of the Seri began to dwindle. By 1850, there was just a small number of them left. The group was rounded up and moved, but was later transported back to the island in a dedicated preservation area built by the government. It wasn't until 1975, though, that they were awarded exclusive rights to the channel by the Mexican government. During the time that the Seri occupied the island, many strange things began happening there. Disappearances and lost expeditions became the notable legends of Tibberon Island. One such event was that of the Grindel expedition. In 1903, Thomas Grindel, an Arizona prospector, made way for the island. When he arrived there, he merely skirted its edges to see if the island was worth a full-scale prospecting operation. After declaring that it was, Grindel headed back to Arizona and began recruiting men who would accompany him on his journey back to Tibberon. There weren't many takers, and in the end, the prospector was only able to get 3 men on board. Together, Grindel, Gus Allender Rawls, D. Ingram, and Jack Hoffman set out on the 10th of June in 1905, accompanied by their guide Dolores Valenzuela. The group traveled light, taking with them the materials for a distillery since fresh water would be a scarce commodity. The expedition would last 2 months, with the promise of being back home by the coming August. The Papago guide led the group through the desert area on the way to the main island. A single donkey carrying all of the stored water trotted along with them. The water, though, would be a complete waste, since the distillery attempt was a failure. With this setback, the guide no longer wanted to continue on the journey, and the rash decision to split up was made. Dolores headed back the way he came, and the remaining men started looking for a boat to take them to Tibberon. August had come and gone, and the men still had not returned. 4 months later, blackened by the sun, an incoherent and exhausted Hoffman emerged in Guaymas. He traveled many miles from the island to make it there, but he was alone. Initially, everyone thought that the group had been the victim of the Seri, who were believed to be cannibalistic. The only survivor of the Grindel expedition testified that the men had succumbed to the elements and had suffered from dehydration, not at the hands of the native people. Grindel's brother, Edward, wanted to locate his brother and figure out what happened to the party, so he set out too on the same venture. When Edward arrived at the town where his brother's expedition had left, he was told by hunters that a group of Americans had their lives taken on the island. The Seri were said to tie up their captives to stakes or driftwood, only taking them piece by piece. But Edward refused to believe that this was his brother's fate and insisted that the group of Americans was not the Grindel expedition. Following in his brother's footsteps eventually led Edward to artifacts belonging to his brother, one of which was Grindel's book, a rifle, and the mule that carried the cans of water. But no bodies were ever found on this search party. Ingram, Grindel, and Rawls were gone. Strangely, the guide Dolores was also never located. 2 years went by, and eventually the remains of Grindel were uncovered, but the rest of the crew, aside from Hoffman, remained missing. In the end, Hoffman became the only confirmed survivor of the Grindel expedition. In 1862, amid the American Civil War, a major battle took place. It was the most violent of them all, one that stained the ground of Pittsburgh. It was the Battle of Shiloh, where 2 Union armies came together to defeat the Confederate Army of Mississippi. The conflict saw 25,000 Union and Confederate soldiers perish. As night came in on the 7th of April, the remaining wounded soldiers, some of whom were still stranded on the muddy battlefield, began to notice something strange. The open slashes, or weeping wounds, were glowing. It was a faint green-blue light emitting from their injuries as they awaited rescue. This event certainly scared the soldiers and the medical assistants who later came to their aid. As the wounded men began flooding into the facilities, a strange pattern began to emerge. The glowing wounds were cleaned and dressed, and doctors soon realized that those whose injuries emitted light had a better healing time. The recovery was much quicker, with minimal post-op complications. Even though the physicians were perplexed at what they were seeing, they found that the glow was also preventing infections. The radiant lacerations were attributed to the mercy of angels, which led to the name Angel's Glow. The phenomenon, though, would be overlooked as a myth. Historians believe that the documentation of this strange event was nothing more than an exaggeration. Some even suggested that the soldiers may have been hallucinating or just spitting out another tale of war. But what historians, experts, and scientists soon learned was that the incident was not exclusive to Shiloh. It appeared that Angel's glow had affected others on different battlefields as well, particularly where the wounded and deceased couldn't immediately be collected. The incident of the glowing wounds was left as a mystery to those of the era. They never knew why the wounds emitted an eerie light. Fast forward 150 years later, when high school student Bill Martin became fascinated with the subject. Bill, along with his mother, a microbiologist, and a friend, headed to the Shiloh battlefield in search of any clues that could explain the Angel's glow. There, they discovered a bioluminescent bacteria and examined the environmental conditions to determine if the bacteria could have been present in 1862. It turned out that the bacteria was present during that time. But how did it get into the weeping wounds of soldiers? The bioluminescent bacteria were known to live inside soil nematodes. In fact, the two had a symbiotic relationship. The bacteria emit a light that attracts insects who would fall victim to the parasitic worms. Once they were inside the insect, the bacteria would be regurgitated, eliminating any toxic microbes. It's believed that while injured and lying on the muddy earth, the soldiers became contaminated with those very nematodes that released the bioluminescent bacteria. It was a quiet morning on the 18th of August in 1961. Fog hung in the air of Capitola, California, as some early rise residents began their morning routines. At 3 a.m., Frank Urbanek was already seated in the back seat of his friend's car. Frank was 18 years old at the time and awoke before dawn to grab breakfast before his 13-hour shift. His morning had been quite unremarkable until then. It was still dark out as Frank peered through the haze at the two-lane street only lit by headlights. Something strange was afoot. As he sat in the back seat, he could see hundreds upon hundreds of birds barreling out of the sky. They were sooty shearwaters. The seabirds were flying erratically through the streets while disgorging fish remnants. Many of them kamikazed into street lamps and rooftops. Residents, disturbed by the sounds of birds flailing their bodies onto their roofs, emerged from their homes armed with flashlights. But once the birds saw the lights, they immediately began barreling toward the homeowners. They retreated quickly and watched in terror from their windows. Still in the back seat, Frank was heading down the road. The birds lay piled thick in the road, and others were strewn across roofs, backyards, and on cars. It looked as though there were millions of them swarming like locusts. Some were still moving, but with a drunken sway, while others lay motionless. Eventually, the vehicle crossed Soquel Creek, and as Frank arrived at the coffee shop a quarter-mile from his home, he found that the birds were there too. Here, the sooty shearwaters were far more restless and erratic. The owner of the coffee shop was baffled as to how relentless the birds were. He claimed that they'd been trying to get into the diner for hours. Later that morning, Frank headed to the docks where he worked. He was about to open the gates of the wharf as the sun was beginning to rise. Just then, one of the birds barreled toward him and began pecking at his leg. It was a strange event that left residents panicked and scientists stumped. The seemingly unprovoked migration led to jammed police switchboards as too many calls were being made. The Capitola police recounted at least 4,000 injured birds, with another 2,000 wobbling around and wailing. By 7 a.m. that morning, many of the sooty shearwaters had flown back out to sea, but it would take many days before the rest would take off. Red Cross arrived in Capitola as well, administering tetanus shots to those who'd been bitten or pecked by the erratic creatures. Even after undergoing several tests, what caused the behavior in the birds was a mystery, and it wasn't until 26 years later that a conclusion was finally met. The seafaring birds had consumed a toxin. A certain type of phytoplankton that produces a neurotoxin had moved up in the food chain. As infected sea creatures made their way to Monterey Bay, the sooty shearwaters began gobbling up many tasty morsels, inevitably infecting them with the same neurotoxin, domoic acid, that poisons the brain. Vampires were a major folklore legend that originated 1,000 years ago in Eastern Europe. The earliest written record of the fictional beasts came from 1047 in Old Russian and first appeared in English in 1731. Mostly, these written records would be detailing a fictional tale for entertainment, but important historical records exist regarding one particular individual. Jure Grando is the first ever real-life person to be described as a vampire. His story began in the late 1500s when he became a villager in the region of Istria, or modern-day Croatia. He was a peasant from the small village of Kringa, who, according to town records, had a wife named Ivana and two daughters, Anna and Nikola. In 1656, well into his life, Jura passed away from natural causes, leaving behind a widow and pure terror in his wake. Every night following his passing for the next 16 years, Jura would terrorize the good people of Kringa. In the middle of the night, he would wander the village, occasionally stopping to knock on a few doors. Residents would awake to the sound only to sink into a pit of despair. They knew what the knock meant. Someone in the household had very little time left. It appeared that if a door was knocked on, someone in the house would pass away in the next few days. Giorgio, a village priest who'd been the one to bury Jura, was the first to piece it together. He realized that the man had inexplicably returned from his grave only to wreak havoc on the town. Ivana would even report that the living corpse had appeared at her windows some nights. The locals began to refer to him as a mix between a warlock and a vampire. Armed with a crucifix, Father Giorgio encountered Jura during one of his nightly rampages. He brandished a cross at the man and ordered him to stop tormenting the villagers. Tears ran down the living corpse's face and he retreated into the darkness. But the resident didn't think that this was enough and chased after him. The group then attempted to pierce the man's heart with a hawthorn stick, but it simply bounced from his chest and Jura made an escape. The next night, 9 villagers came together along with Father Giorgio. They headed to the churchyard and uncovered the supposed vampire's coffin. As they opened the wooden box, they found the man lying awake, perfectly preserved with an eerie smile stretched across his face. Giorgio performed an exorcism and a stick was driven through his chest, but again it just bounced off. Another attempt was made and this time it was successful, and finally peace returned to Kringa. The legend of Jura Grando was told to Johann Weikert von Valvassor, who visited the village on his travels. He researched it and recorded it in an anthology. In recent years, the story of the first real-life vampire has been examined by many scientists at the University of Zagreb, who believed that there must be a scientific explanation behind it all. Nestled in Wilder, Kentucky in the United States, one will find Bobby Mackey's Music World, a nightclub and far from average honky-tonk bar that's shrouded in pure eeriness. The site wasn't always fun-filled and a bustling attraction like we see it today. Its vibrant history has earned its spot in paranormal lore. It attracts not just country music lovers, but also thrill seekers and supernatural enthusiasts from all across the globe. The building's chilling history started in 1850 when it was being used as a small slaughterhouse at a meatpacking facility. The abattoir was constructed to serve northwestern Kentucky as well as Cincinnati, Ohio. In the lowest area of the building, a well was dug out to be used for waste storage. In the 1890s, the slaughterhouse closed down. Some researchers speculate that it became the place for satanic cult activity thereafter. During these secret meetings, it's thought that many sacrifices had taken place here. In 1896, the corpse of 22-year-old Pearl Bryna, a small-town girl from Greencastle, Indiana, was found less than 2 miles away. It was speculated that her boyfriend, Scott Jackson from Ohio, may have had ties to a local satanic cult. In the early part of the 20th century, the abandoned slaughterhouse was demolished, and the lot stood empty until the 1920s. A new building was erected and served as a casino and nightclub, as well as a speakeasy amid the Prohibition. When the Prohibition ended in 1933, an entrepreneur, Buck Brady, bought the property and named it Primrose Club. After more than a decade of running a successful nightclub, Primrose grabbed the attention of Cincinnati mobsters who attempted to muscle their way into the business. But Brady refused to sell the business, which only led to escalating violence and threats towards customers in the parking lot. Eventually, Brady left the scene and the mob overtook the place. It would later be renamed the Latin Quarter and became a rough-and-tumble club. In 1978, following a series of fatal attacks at the establishment, the authorities were forced to close it. That same year, country singer Bobby Mackey bought the building and turned it into the same music hall and tavern that stands today. But since its opening, the building has found itself terrorized by a paranormal presence. While Bobby himself was skeptical, he didn't doubt the word of his family, employees, patrons, and even police officers, each of whom had experienced some unexplainable activity there. Despite the aid of the clergy and psychic intervention, dark forces are said to still linger there. Some believe that the building's basement is a portal to hell, and the stairs nearby have been nicknamed the stairs that go to nowhere. A former caretaker who resided in the upstairs apartment alleged that he was demonically possessed and that an exorcism was performed on him in the club by a local minister. A patron also claimed to have experienced a suffocating heat and a scene involving a flying trash can. Bobby's wife was reportedly pushed down the stairs by a force that was said to resemble sketches of Alonzo Walling. She never set foot in the nightclub again. Jutting from the landscape of Granada, Spain, is a palace and fortress known as Alhambra. It was built between 1238 and 1358 upon a plateau overlooking the city of Granada during the Nasrid dynasty. Ordering the construction of Alhambra, Amar, the leader, had moved the royal residence to a new location, and it was here that Granada would enter its era of greatest artistic splendor. During the 14th century, after the completion of the two main towers, 3 Nasrid palaces were erected. This included the Mexwar, the Camaras, and the Lions. At the base of the plateau, there runs a deep ravine, the Darro River. The park situated outside is adorned by roses, oranges, and myrtles. The most characteristic feature surrounding Alhambra is the dense forest of English elms. There's no doubt that the palace is incredibly beautiful, making it a must-see tourist attraction. Even in the most well-known and incredible tourist sites, there lies a strange past that goes untold during tours. Writer José Manuel Frias decided that one peculiar event that took place continuously over the centuries could not go untold. Granada is known for its many mysteries, including the tunnels that lie beneath the fortress and the enigmatic carvings that have been found within. In his book Mysterious Granada, Jose recounts historical documentation that reached his research team. The mythical elf is a creature of legend and folklore, taking on various appearances and several descriptions. Alhambra found itself at the center of one such legend, a story that was built upon eyewitness testimonies that eventually reached the writer. In 1492, the Arabic civilization abandoned the fortress, hoping that they could one day return. Such hopes also appeared to have been harbored by an alleged group of protective elves. It's said that this enigmatic group of elves was part of the Arabic tribes who hoped to reclaim the palace that they once called home. Information regarding such stories was chronicled in Granada Mysterious. The first historical report about the arrival of the elves dates back to the 2nd of January, 1792. Various inhabitants of Granada who lived near the palace reported seeing 7 goblins or elves dressed in brilliant white apparel congregating in Alhambra. Together they cried out, disturbing the neighbors all night, supposedly reminiscing about the past. They stayed there throughout the evening, wailing with an attitude of vigil. They hoped that the prophecy of reclaiming their home would come true. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Alhambra had become neglected until it was occupied by Napoleon's French troops. During this period, the palace was almost destroyed. In 1870, it became state property and was declared a national monument. It seems that there are some forces, though, that want it back. As dawn drew in, the elves saw that nothing had changed, and so enveloped in misery, each went back to their origins. They promised to return each century in an effort to make Alhambra their home once more, and that they did. On the 2nd of January, 1892, they returned, again witnessed by neighbors and documented in written accounts. Many claim to have heard the muffled cries emitting from the palace, but again the elves were unsuccessful in reclaiming their home and departed. On the 2nd of January, 1992, white robes swayed into the fortress, again seen by onlookers, and congregated within the palace. They wailed and wept all evening. The sun rose, and they were off again. Every 2nd of January, once a century, every 100 years, ending in 92, the elves return to see if Alhambra has been returned to its rightful owners. Their next visit will be due in 2092, 66 years from now. It's said that they'll return again in hopes of regaining the place that they once called home, but were forced to abandon some 6 centuries ago. Imagine hearing about a town, and even knowing a few people that came from there, only to find out later that it supposedly never existed. This is exactly what happened to a small town that many people claim existed in Wisconsin. And today, the debate ranges on whether it simply disappeared or ever existed at all. The town in question was called Dublin, and much like the town of Langville in Montana, many people have memories of not only hearing about it, but also visiting friends and relatives there at some point. It's said that Dublin existed in the heart of Wisconsin up until the 1990s, when it suddenly vanished from maps. Some people have suggested that the town may have simply changed its name, but no records exist of such a change being made. Even stranger is the fact that no records of Dublin seem to exist at all. No one has been able to find any property records, public officials who served there, census information, or the name of anyone who lived there in the past. Surely this means that the town never existed, and that its name is either a case of shared false memory or a hoax that someone created. This would be a logical assumption to make if it weren't for the fact that many people have proof that they visited that town. Several people have come forward, stating that they have distinct memories of visiting Dublin, and they've even shown off souvenirs, such as coffee mugs and t-shirts containing the town's name. This has led to many theories over the years as to what happened to the town, and why people believe so adamantly that it existed. The most obvious is that it's all a hoax, that the souvenirs that people own were created after the fact to keep the rumors alive. In fact, it would be very easy for someone to print a few t-shirts and mugs with Dublin printed on them, and then to claim that they bought these items while visiting a friend or relative who lived there. Another theory that's been put forward is that the town disappeared thanks to an earthquake that resulted in a massive sinkhole opening up, which then swallowed the entire town. But once a sinkhole opens up, it doesn't usually close up again of its own accord, and hence it would still be present at the supposed site of Dublin today, which it isn't. It's also been suggested that the town was washed away thanks to flooding caused by large-scale damming that took place in Wisconsin at one point. At the time, many dams burst their banks, and some people feel it's possible that the town was completely destroyed by one of these incidents. If this were the case, it would have resulted in the loss of hundreds, if not thousands of lives, and there's no record anywhere of such a tragedy. But there is one theory that's so outlandish that most people refuse to even consider it. Some people who believe Dublin existed think that it may still be in the same spot that it's always been, but it's been rendered invisible by unknown forces. Most people, though, accept the theory that its existence is merely a hoax, and that Dublin never existed in the first place. Missing people mysteries are among the most popular on the internet, likely because many of these cases contain clues, such as the missing person's last known whereabouts, but that isn't enough to bring the case to a close. The case of 24-year-old Barbara McClure is no different, as her family and friends are still trying to come to terms with the fact that she's been missing without a trace for decades, and that they're no closer to learning what happened to her. In November of 1978, Barbara was living in Seattle, Washington, and on the night of the 2nd of November, she went out on a night out with a few of her friends. The group traveled to a restaurant called the Sirloin, and inside they also attended a disco called the Fandango. But at one point in the night, Barbara and one of her friends ended up getting into an argument, and she decided to leave. According to her friends, she opted to walk home rather than ask for a ride, and she was never seen again. To make matters worse, she had a 2-year-old daughter named Stoopy at home, and she grew up getting to know her mother through only the stories that her family could tell her. She's always been told that Barbara loved her very much and that she was a confident and loving person. According to the case file, some of Barbara's friends left the club right after she did, and they managed to find her with one of their cars. They then drove alongside her, trying to get her in, but she refused, saying that she would rather walk. 6 days after she went missing, a group of workers were conducting maintenance on a road and found her driver's license lying at the intersection of I-5 and I-405, just a short distance from the city of Bothell. This has raised many questions in the investigation. It's been suggested that Barbara may have thrown her license out of a car window after being abducted, that she accidentally dropped it while still walking, or that it may have been placed there by someone who wanted it to be found. Her family is of the opinion that the license was placed there intentionally, and that the person who left it there harmed Barbara in some way. But there's one detail in the case that has come to light recently, and it's left her daughter baffled. She stated that she had information that Barbara was being followed in the days before her disappearance, but she has no idea who this person was, other than that they were hired to do this. Detectives, on the other hand, claim that no such person ever existed, and that this is merely a rumor that has no basis in reality. Barbara's house was 5 miles from the Sirloin restaurant, a distance that she would normally have covered without any issues, and hence it's believed she either met with foul play or decided to leave of her own accord. The last time that she was seen, Barbara was wearing a green and rust-colored blouse with stripes, a black leather jacket, corduroy pants, and tan boots, and she was also carrying a brown purse that's never been found. She has brown hair, blue eyes, and may be using a different last name, such as Anderson. If you have any useful information on this case, you're asked to contact the Keene County Sheriff's Office at 206-205-7887. For centuries, there's been a debate and speculation as to whether a remarkable book, the Book of Thoth, really existed, since the person who possesses it would gain remarkable powers that most of us would only dream of. Thoth is the ancient Egyptian god of writing and knowledge. He's said to have written this book himself, and that it contains a collection of some very important texts, but many believe it's merely a legend and that it never existed to begin with. The reason for the debate is the fact that the Book of Thoth is mentioned on several occasions in different papyri from the time, which is said to be from the 2nd century of the Ptolemaic period. That would mean that it was likely created sometime between 200 and 100 BC. It's mentioned in the text for the first time in the Tours Papyrus, which was published in the latter part of the 18th century. In this text, it said that someone attempted to end the pharaoh's life using spells from the Book of Thoth, but they were unsuccessful. The book also has a very interesting story connected to it. It's said that a man named Neferkaptah had no interest in other people, animals, or anything other than the ancient writings that he loved to study. He would spend most of his days reading through these texts that he found on papyri or on the walls of the many temples that he used to visit. It's said that one day he became so obsessed with these writings while at a temple that he forgot to pray and hence had forgotten about the gods for a minute. He only came to his senses when he heard a priest laughing at him, and when asked for an explanation, the priest explained that he'd been reading a set of useless inscriptions and that if he wanted to read something more interesting, he could direct him to the location of the Book of Thoth. He explained that the book contained all the known magic in the world, and that if he read even just a few pages, he would be able to talk to animals, return to the land of the living after he passed away, and even be able to see all of the celestial bodies in the sky with his naked eye at any given time. The priest told him that if Neferkaptah was willing to pay for his funeral with 100 silver pieces, he would give him a clue to the book's location. He obliged and paid the money, after which he was given the following clue. It read, quote, "The book is at Koptos in the middle of the river. In the middle of the river is an iron box. In the iron box is a bronze box. In the bronze box is a wood box. In the wood box is an ivory and ebony box. In the ivory and ebony box is a silver box. In the silver box is a gold box, and in the gold box is the Book of Thoth. Round about the great iron box are snakes and scorpions and all manner of crawling things, and above all there's a snake that no man can kill. These are set to guard the Book of Thoth." Neferkaptah set out on a long journey and eventually found the book. He learned all of its spells and became a powerful mage, but Thoth learned that the book had been stolen and swore revenge. In the end, Neferkaptah, his wife, and his son all lost their lives in the river. He was buried with the same honor as a king, and the book was buried beside him, never to be seen again. Whether this book actually existed or not is a matter of debate, but most scholars believe that it's merely a tale of fiction told by people who were alive at that time. Archaeology is a very interesting field that teaches us about civilizations that lived long ago, the beliefs that they held, the food they ate, the clothes they wore, and the way they lived their everyday lives. These facts are gleaned from artifacts that are found across the world, but some of these finds provide us with more questions than answers, such as the discovery of the Los Lunas Decalogue stone, which was found in Albuquerque, New Mexico. While there are many stories of the stone existing before then, the first records we have of the stone were made by an archaeologist from the University of New Mexico, Frank Hibben, in 1933. What makes the stone so intriguing is the fact that it has all of the 10 Commandments from the Bible written on it. As for its age, some people believe it may date back as many as 2,000 years, while others think it's probably only about 500 years old. Hibben stated that he was taken by a guide to the site where the stone was discovered, and that he had to remove lichen and other debris from it before he could read it. This has been disputed though, since Hibben has a somewhat soiled record when it comes to his findings. On more than one occasion, he was caught changing data to make his finds look more impressive. On one occasion, he claimed to have discovered a cave showing that people lived there 25,000 years ago. But subsequent studies showed that the site was only about 14,000 years old. The script on the stone is of Paleo-Hebrew origin, and the stone itself is carved out of basalt. Many different scholars have studied the stone and its text, and they found some very interesting points. Some of the Hebrew lettering was substituted with Greek letters. Some of the Hebrew letters and symbols are known to have been used during the Middle Ages, leading some scholars to believe that it is nowhere near as ancient as Hibben claimed. It also contains several spelling errors, such as the fact that the author mistakenly added a symbol that they believed it should be read as one sound, when it actually should be written as two separate sounds. Thanks to these errors, many archaeologists and scientists are skeptical about the stone's authenticity, since the text is seen as sacred, and if written by an ancient Hebrew, these errors would have never been present. But it is possible that the text was written by someone whose first language was Greek rather than Hebrew, and that these errors were honest mistakes that went unnoticed at the time. Most of us are familiar with some of the most famous navigators in history, such as Christopher Columbus, Francis Drake, Marco Polo, Lewis and Clark, and David Livingstone, all of whom had a major impact on our knowledge of the world. But there is one navigator that very few people have heard of, and some believe that he may have made one of the most important discoveries of all time: the location of the Americas, as far back as the 6th century. Brendan the Navigator was born in Ireland in the late 5th century, at a time when the Irish were just starting to accept Christianity. He was deeply influenced by the Christian faith as well as his Celtic culture, and when he turned 6 years old, he was sent to a monastery where he furthered his religious education. He remained there for the next 20 years, and when he turned 26, he was ordained as a priest. He then traveled across the country, gathering as much knowledge as he could, including stories of Irishmen who'd sailed across the sea in the past, discovering lands that no one had seen or heard of before. In time, he came to be regarded as an important Christian leader, but he decided to spread the message even further, and he traveled to Wales, Scotland, and France to do so. It's said that his teachings in these areas were instrumental in spreading Irish monastic ideals. He would undertake one of these journeys once every 7 years, and on one occasion, he felt inspired by a monk named Berenthus, who told him of an idyllic place called the Land of Promise of the Saints that he had once visited. Brendan decided that he needed to see this land for himself, and after receiving a vision from an angel, his mind was made up. He was certain that he could find it, and along with a number of his fellow monks, he set sail on a small leather boat, and for the next 7 years, they searched the seas. In his account of the journey, he stated that he visited many different islands where he met strange people. He also claimed to have had several harrowing encounters with sea monsters and birds that could sing songs. On one occasion, he claims to have met several demons on a desolate, rocky island. On another occasion, according to his account, they decided to make landfall on a small island since it was Easter and they wanted to celebrate the holiday. But soon after getting off their boat, the island started to move, and they were shocked to realize that they'd accidentally landed on a massive sea turtle. After years of exploration, the party finally found what they were looking for. They described the Land of Promise as one filled with lush vegetation, plenty of fruit to eat, and precious stones that they easily unearthed. The group stayed in that area for a short while, but according to Brendan, he was then told by an angel that they needed to return to Ireland and that they needed to take as much of the fruit and stones with them as they could. Once back in Ireland, he told his fellow monks of the incredible journey, and the account was written down in a text that translates to The Voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot. Many people believe that the entire journey never took place, and that Brendan either fabricated it or it was a tale written by an unknown author. But others believe that the Land of Promise may be the Americas, and that Brendan found it long before Columbus or the Vikings ever did. The Eleusinian Mysteries of ancient Greece were a series of religious rituals that were not only considered to be very secretive, but that promised its practitioners a better afterlife once they were initiated. These rituals were carried out for a millennium and are thought to have ended around 329 CE. In September every year, a festival would be held starting in the town of Eleusis, which lies close to Athens, and it would last for several days. During the festival, people would recount the story of Demeter and Persephone, her daughter. Demeter, who was the goddess of agriculture, became distressed when her daughter Kore went missing. She neglected the earth and everything that grew on it, but when Zeus discovered that Kore had been abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld, he ordered that she be returned to her mother. But this was no longer possible. According to legend, anyone who eats anything while in the underworld can never return, and Kore had accepted a single pomegranate seed from Hades, which she then ingested. Hence, she could only spend 6 months with Demeter, but had to remain in the underworld for the rest of each year. She then became the goddess of the dead and was renamed Persephone, after which she married Hades. This is where the Eleusinian mysteries have their origins. It's said that while Demeter was searching for Kore, she disguised herself as a human and visited Eleusis. She was given a job as a nurse, and in return she revealed her true identity, sharing these sacred rituals with the Eleusinian people, which then became the Eleusinian mysteries. It took 9 days before Demeter finally found out what happened to Kore, and so the rite takes 9 days to complete, but this must be done by each initiate in complete secrecy. The first 5 days are used for purification, sacrifices that are made to Demeter, and fasting. On the 5th day, they would make their way to Demeter's sanctuary, but they'd be given no instructions upon their arrival. This leaves them confused, just as Demeter was while searching for her daughter. When this stage is completed, the initiates would enter Demeter's temple. It was large enough to accommodate thousands of the initiates, and what happened once they entered was meant to be the most secret part of the rituals. Each person was given a drink, which usually was made with herbs and water, though some scholars speculate that it may have contained a hallucinogen of some kind, but this has never been proven. The rest of the rituals remain a secret, though it's thought that the priests and priestesses entered a small room where they were shown certain visions. These visions were then recounted to the initiates, many of whom described being terrified, and after the fact having no more fear of death. On the 9th day, the initiates would leave the building and walk back to Athens, where the festival would be brought to a close. These rites were first mentioned in the 8th century BC by a poet called Hesiod. Thanks to the secrecy surrounding the Eleusinian mysteries, not much is known about what happens inside the temple, and many scholars find it remarkable that these rites have been kept a secret for so many centuries. Codex of Rohan is an ancient manuscript that has mystified scholars since its discovery in 1838, and in the long years that followed, many attempts have been made to find out who wrote it and what its contents mean. The codex was discovered in medieval times, but when it was studied, it was found to contain what looked like outdated Hungarian writing, only no one could understand what any of the words meant. The 448 pages in the manuscript are written from right to left, and the characters resemble that of Old Hungarian writings, but are far enough removed from those to be indecipherable. It was also compared to Hindi, but it was also too dissimilar to be read. The symbols used on the pages are so numerous that they outnumbered the letters of any known alphabet tenfold. Further confounding scholars is the fact that each of the 448 pages is watermarked with a symbol that resembles an anchor inside of a circle. Strangely, the watermarks are thought to have been added later on, since they've been dated back to around 1530 AD. This has led to speculation that the original codex has been lost, and that the one that was discovered was transcribed from that original. Then there are the baffling illustrations that have been found on these mysterious pages. The book contains 87 in all, including depictions of religious figures from Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. Some of the other illustrations seem to depict military battles that took place long ago, and landscapes that the author may have visited while writing the text. It has hence been suggested that the writer may have lived in an area where these three religions were openly practiced alongside one another. When it comes to deciphering the text, there have been many difficulties. The first seems rudimentary, but poses a real problem as scholars are uncertain which language the author used or based their writings on, and hence they don't know whether it should be read from left to right, right to left, top to bottom, or the inverse. One theory is known as the Old Hungarian alphabet hypothesis, which suggests that it's describing topics from the Bible's New Testament, but no proof has ever been presented that this is the case. If the text is based on Indian Brahmi script, it should be read from top to bottom. One scholar, Mahesh Kumar Singh, claims that he translated one of the texts based on this theory, and that the Codex is a retelling of the Gospel. He claims that it then contains a thoughtful prologue and stories from Jesus' years as an infant. Most scholars have refuted this claim, though, and cite Singh's claims to be a hoax. Another theory holds that it's meant to be read from right to left and top to bottom, but this theory has never been proven. Lastly, one scholar believes that the book should be turned upside down before being read, and that the text is of Sumerian origin. But once again, this theory has many inconsistencies and has failed to definitively translate any of the strange words in the book, since it requires the reader to move some of the symbols around. The author, meaning, and origins of the Codex remain a mystery for now, but efforts are still ongoing to decipher it. If this is ever done, it could teach us more about our ancient past, or it could hold no significance whatsoever. Stumbling across a message in a bottle seems like a romantic notion that's usually only seen in the movies, but there have been a few instances where people have found these objects years after they were cast into the ocean. One such message was thrown from an ill-fated British ship, the Lusitania, as it was about to disappear under the waves during the First World War. The ship was owned by the Cunard Steamship Line Shipping Company, and it made its first voyage on the 7th of June 1906. When the war broke out, German forces sent out a warning that people should refrain from traveling on British passenger ships, since they would be sunk by German submarines. They suspected that these passenger ships were being used to transport supplies to the British, and hence they could not be allowed to pass. At the time, the Lusitania was making regular trips between New York and Liverpool in England. But on the 7th of May, 1915, it encountered a German U-boat and was immediately fired upon. According to witnesses, they heard two massive explosions. The first was attributed to the torpedo that hit the ship, but no one was certain what caused the second. German officers took this to mean it was caused by munitions that were on board, thereby justifying their actions. In the minutes that followed, passengers on the ship started to panic, and they raced to find a way off the liner. 761 people were rescued from the water, but many more lost their lives, either due to the explosion or in the water after the fact. Just 18 minutes after the explosion, the Lusitania sank below the waves and was lost. When word of this heinous act reached the public, they demanded that the US declare war against Germany, since many of those who perished were from America. The US would enter the war 2 years later, and German U-boats were now required to warn passenger ships before firing on them. The sinking of the Lusitania was even used in US military recruitment posters that read, "Remember the Lusitania." The incident is still spoken about today as a good example of the horrors that come with wartime, since many innocent people who had nothing to do with the conflict lost their lives needlessly. When it comes to historical murder mysteries, the case of Donna Dahl isn't one that immediately springs to mind, but it's a fascinating mystery that has left investigators baffled for decades, thanks to some of the bizarre details it contains. The year was 1970, when Donna was 21 years old. She was friends with a woman, also named Donna, though they had different last names. Donna Dahl was in the midst of her studies at the Northern Illinois University. She had ambitions of becoming a teacher and at the time was studying Russian. When she wasn't in class or her room, she was located on West Lincoln Highway, where she worked at Swen Parson Library for extra money. On the 2nd of October that year, she made plans with the other Donna, and they were meant to meet up at the library. They'd not seen each other since June, when the second Donna got married, and by all accounts they were excited to catch up. Since they both had time that evening, they arranged for a walk and a cup of coffee when Donna finished her shift at the library. But when her friend arrived, she realized Donna wasn't there. She waited for about 20 minutes, but when Donna still didn't show up, she assumed that she'd simply been delayed somehow and couldn't make it. But when her fellow students realized on Sunday that they hadn't seen Donna for 2 days, they became concerned. When they checked her time card at the library, they found that she'd left at 9:59 on Friday night, but never made it back to her lodgings. They started to panic and filed a missing person report on Sunday, the 4th of October. When investigators searched Donna's room, they found that her clothes were still there, as well as her suitcase and her last paycheck that had not been cashed yet. Her family felt that something sinister had happened, but the police felt otherwise, since they learned that she was in a relationship with a man who lived in Pittsburgh. They believed she'd simply left the campus to visit him and that she'd likely be back on Monday. They felt that she kept this relationship a secret since the man was either still married or recently separated, something that Donna's parents would never have approved of. For the next week, no one heard from the missing woman, and on the 11th of October, 3 people were on their way to a party when they stopped to pick up beers that they'd hidden in a cornfield. Here, they found Donna deceased, and they reported their find to the police. The area had been searched before, but the search ended about a quarter mile from the spot where she was found. The only pieces of Donna's clothing that were missing were her shoes, though she was dressed in a different jacket from the one that she was last seen wearing. The shoes, her coat, and her purse have never been located. It was later determined that she'd lost her life due to suffocation. She had no marks on her body, which is usually a good indicator that she knew the person who ended her life. But there was one detail that no one was able to explain. Donna had eaten as much as 6 pounds of potatoes before she lost her life. A man named Charles Burke later became a suspect. He and Donna had been in a relationship, but she told the other Donna that she was considering ending things between them, since he wasn't a very good person. He was eventually cleared, and to this day, Donna's attacker and her strange last meal remains a mystery that may never be solved. Charles refused to comment on the case, and we may never know if he was the one who truly ended her life that night. There's no doubt that our climate can be very delicate, and that any major natural disaster could have a massive impact on how we live our lives. Floods displace millions of people every year. Earthquakes wreak havoc all over the world, and in some cases, these result in tsunamis that claim even more lives. But there is one such disaster that arguably dwarfs all of these. While these events can be devastating, one event that took place in 536 resulted in that year being named the worst time to have been alive in all of history. That year, people were left baffled by a strange fog that started to cover a massive area, including the Middle East, much of Europe, and parts of Asia. According to some accounts, the fog was so thick that the sun was unable to shine through it, and most days it seemed as though it was being eclipsed by the moon. In a very short time, temperatures started to plummet. The resulting cold claimed many lives, but the worst was yet to come. Since the sun's rays were unable to reach the earth, crops started to die, leaving thousands of people without food, and before long they began to starve. Notes from the historian Procopius state that the sun shone, but offered no heat since it was permanently obscured behind the fog. He added that this gave way to attacks, disease, and famine, all of which claimed many lives. A Roman politician, Cassiodorus, wrote that he and his friends were amazed by the fact that they could no longer see their own shadows, even at noon, and that the seasons no longer had any meaning under a waning sun that he described as bluish in color. For many years, these accounts were taken with a grain of salt, since they seemed almost too fantastical to be true. But in the 1990s, scientists studied tree rings from trees in Ireland, and what they found surprised them. They discovered that the temperatures in Asia and Europe were about 36 degrees Fahrenheit colder than normal during the summer, and that the reports showed snow falling in China during their summer, and soon researchers were able to find the cause. It's now known that the fog was caused by one, or possibly several, massive volcanic eruptions that spewed huge amounts of ash into the Earth's atmosphere. This resulted in what's now referred to as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, possibly the worst time for anyone to be alive in Europe and the rest of the Northern Hemisphere. After the eruptions, there was no sunshine for 18 months, which must have been an utterly terrifying ordeal for people who were alive at the time, especially since they would have no idea what was causing the mysterious fog. It was quite literally one of the darkest periods in all of human history, caused by the eruption of a volcano, or volcanoes that lay thousands of miles away from the people that were the most affected. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.